This is a psalm that on the one hand shows this older background of a kind of mild polytheism compared to Ugarit, but let's not worry about that descriptor. But they're also saying, but it's not really true. That mild polytheism isn't really true. And they sort of dramatize, they give a kind of polytheistic to monotheistic drama in this psalm, which people have just found incredibly difficult because they say, how could they acknowledge that it really was once polytheistic? But I think that's our problem and not theirs.
Hello, welcome everyone to Star Views. Again, tonight it's a pleasure to be here with Professor Mark Smith. Mark Smith is Old Testament Literature and Exegesis professor at the Princeton Theological Seminary. He earned his PhD at Yale, where he also taught. He also was a professor at New York University and St. Joseph University. Visiting professor at the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, as well as the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Professor Smith has written 16 books and hundreds of articles, and he specializes in Israelite religion and the Hebrew Bible, and as well as the literature and religion of the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit. We'll talk about that later. And welcome very much, Professor Smith, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor. So the Bible, the Bible seems to be the book par excellence. Is the book, and there are billions of people, even nowadays, because they follow. Or they think they follow what is written in the Bible when they make a decision in their life. So it's a very important text, but it's also the history of the Bible is very complex. So maybe to start, can you explain with easy words when and how the Bible took shape? And what, maybe what manuscripts do we read, and if we have any original copies, who wrote it when, and so on.
So I'm going to be focusing my comments about the Bible on what is called the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, Tanakh in Jewish tradition, also Mikra. And I'm not going to be focusing on the New Testament, largely because I'm not a New Testament professor. So when we speak about the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, we're talking about a rather substantial series of works that date from different times. I would say that we don't really know the earliest date of the earliest text of the Hebrew Bible, but I suspect, maybe the 11th century or so, perhaps. That is the traditions. I won't say maybe necessarily the text itself, but the sort of core traditions of a poem like Judges 5, some material in Psalm 68, perhaps, and some other pieces of poetry that go back, I don't know, maybe not all the way to the 11th century, but the 10th or 9th century. And of course, we have works in the Bible that go all the way down to the 2nd century. So parts of the book of Daniel, often dated to the time of the Maccabean conflict, or just before the Maccabean conflict, around 165. So it has 1,000-year, almost perhaps 1,000-year stretch of time, all kinds of genres. And of course, each biblical book itself has a certain amount of diachronic development embedded within it. So even, you take any particular book, and it's biblical scholars will give you their theories about how the book developed over time. There's no such thing as an autograph, a copy that happened just at the moment as it's related in the text. Our oldest manuscripts come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, so we really don't and this we're really talking about from around the time of Jesus, from about the late 3rd century or 2nd century BC, BCE, down through the 1st century CE or AD. So those are really our oldest manuscripts. We do have inscriptions that are earlier that do give us extremely strong parallels to a few things that are in the Bible. For example, we have inscriptions about the seer named Balaam, who's known from the book of Numbers in chapters 22 to 24. We have we have an inscription from the area, place called Der Allah, the Der Allah inscription, that mentions the same figure by name. Similarly, the priestly blessing that we know from Numbers chapter 6, we also have a very close form of it in a silver amulet that was discovered in Jerusalem, the site called Ketef Hinnom. So we do have, we have some very interesting things in terms of inscriptions. We have other kinds of extra biblical material that relates directly to some texts that we have attested in the Bible. So even though our manuscript traditions tend to be rather late, so we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, still we know from other inscriptional material that in fact some of these things didn't just appear on the scene at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. They go far further back than that. And my assumption is if we had more material from the ancient world, we would know even more than that. But that remains to be seen.
So we have extra biblical sources confirming the stories or the history that is contained in the Bible, but the text itself, we don't have an original copy, so we don't have an autograph, what you call it. So we have copies of copies of copies. So from a philological point of view, it's a delicate text that needs to be treated in a certain way, correct?
Yes, it does have to be treated very carefully, and we presume, based on the differences between the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts, the manuscripts that we have in Hebrew otherwise, apart from the Dead Sea Scrolls, such as the traditional Jewish text, the so-called Masoretic text, which is really known best from medieval copies, as well as Greek versions, Old Latin versions, Jerome's version, Latin version, Syriac, Targumic Aramaic, etc. The differences among them sometimes also show that there's some fluidity or certainly many differences, certainly a great deal of agreement, but certainly differences that shows that the wording isn't really nailed down per se until quite a bit later after the biblical period.
I conducted quite a lot of research on the Bible. I have some of your books here, and I would like to name three: the Memoirs of God. Maybe later I will show it in with a screen that show it better, and the Early History of God. And there is another one more important, that is the origins of biblical monotheism, Israel's polytheistic background, and the Ugaritic texts. I encourage everyone to read them because they are very, very interesting. At least I found them very interesting. So polytheism, basically in your books and conferences, you say that monotheism was not born out of the blue, but it was a process. So can you maybe tell us first what is this polytheistic background that you discuss in these books in the ancient Israel?
Yeah. So in the context of ancient Israel, we know from texts outside of the Bible, such as the Ugaritic texts, that there was what I think of as a reduced polytheism compared to what we know from Mesopotamia or from Egypt. And that signs of this reduced polytheism are also found in the Bible itself. That is, usually when people discuss the issue of polytheism versus monotheism, many people think that polytheism is something that only Israel's neighbors have, or the other peoples of the ancient Near East, but that Israel is thoroughly monotheistic. And when it isn't thoroughly monotheistic, it's because they've fallen away from the old monotheistic ideal, which they believe is laid out in the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. Now, there are scholars for a very long time, and this is not hardly original with me. I'm largely summarizing in some of my work, like the early history of God, I'm really summarizing what has been a direction of study with new information and new research thoughts going back over a century about polytheism within ancient Israel. Now, first about the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments never really speak directly to monotheism. What they speak to is, you shall have no other gods before me, al panai, literally at my face, which really means face in the sense of presence. So there seems to be at least some move, say, toward exclusive worship, but it doesn't really speak to the issue of there is no other God. And the language of there is no other God is found in the Bible. So we shouldn't simply assume that when we see exclusivity of worship, it means monotheism. So the book of Deuteronomy, for example, in chapter 4 has several expressions of monotheism. There is no other God. There is no God beside me, etc. And there are other passages in the Bible as well. As for the signs of polytheism in the Bible, we do have a number of these, and scholars have pointed these out. They've been problematic for the tradition. One of my own personal favorites is probably an old poetic tradition in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 to 9, which refers to the number of the sons of God in the Septuagint and in one of the Dead Sea Scroll manuscripts of Deuteronomy, but in the Masoretic text substitutes according to the number of the sons of Israel. So it substitutes Israel for Elohim. Elohim is the word for gods. And what we probably see there is that the Hebrew text, someone can't believe that anyone would ever say according to the number of the sons of God, because that's polytheistic. And so the Masoretic text has reinterpreted, or shows a reinterpretation of that line by reference to the number of the sons of Israel. And the tradition is that the number of the children of Israel is 70, which we know from Genesis 46 and Exodus 1, I think verse 6, but in any case. But that's also the tradition of how many gods there are in the world, because according to the idea in Deuteronomy 32, 8 to 9, the idea is elsewhere, it's even in Hesiod in its own way, but that's another story, is that each nation had its own god. And the later tradition is going to develop this into the idea of each nation having its own guardian angel. So 70 nations, 70 gods, 70 guardian angels, which is informing the book of Daniel, that Gabriel and Michael, these are guardian angels of different nations. So there is a kind of old polytheism lurking in various corners of the Old Testament. And I could give more examples, but I'll let you ask your next question instead.
No, this is very interesting, and I have many follow-up questions, but maybe later, because first I want to ask you. So basically, Yahweh is the protagonist of the Bible narratives. If I'm correct, in your books, you explain that Yahweh is somewhat conjures together many elements, language, attributes, titles, coming from different deities from surrounding cultures. So what were the surrounding cultures of ancient Israel that provided these elements that conflated then in Yahweh?
Yeah. So before I answer your question, I would like to sort of slightly repose the paradigm as expressed in your question. I actually don't think of Israel, say, in the 12th and 11th century as all that different from its neighbors. And I think what we do is we tend to think of Israel as so separate based on the fact that we read the Bible and we don't read the Ugaritic texts as if they're a Bible. And also because the later view of the biblical authors from maybe the late monarchy on, perhaps from the 8th or 7th century on, we're starting to get this strong idea that we're really different from the others. But I think in part they're reacting to their own older polytheistic past. I actually think that early Israel and the Canaanite culture that's around it are not easily separatable. You can't separate them as readily as people assume that you can. Now, let me answer your question though. So in the Ugaritic text, which I keep mentioning, and I'm holding up I really like this particular version here. I'll hold it up a little closer. The reason I like this is because it has nice introductions to the text. These are all this sort of longer, what we might think of as mythological or legendary texts from ancient Ugaritic. And besides having nice introductions, I really like that it has translation on one side and the English transliteration right next to it. And the traditions that we have for Yahweh, we have in Ugaritic for Baal. So Baal defeats the sea, which is who Yahweh defeats in Psalm 29. Or Baal defeats Leviathan. Leviathan is even more famous than sea as a cosmic enemy, thanks to Thomas Hobbes' book called Leviathan. Right, so from the 17th century. So the whole complex of features around the god Baal become part of the repertoire also of the god Yahweh. And I think what happens over the course of the history of Israelite religion is that we might say that Yahweh, how will I put this? There's both a process of convergence of other features, divine features on Yahweh that may not have been originally associated with him. And those are drawing from other deities. And at the same time, they're pushing those other deities away. There's sort of a push-pull there. Maybe early on, it was more complex than that. It may have been convergence without what I call differentiation from other deities for a while. But it does seem to me that some of not just the enemies of Baal and Yahweh being similar, but some of their very titles. Baal is called the rider of the clouds. There's in Psalm 68, Yahweh is the rider over the Aravot, which is virtually the same spelling as clouds, but is being interpreted in biblical Hebrew as over the steppe lands. But you'll notice the context of Psalm 68, he's a storm god, which is of course what Baal is. They're both warriors as well. So there's a series of not just the names of the actual enemies of the deity. It isn't just general features. Both are storm gods, both are powerful divine warriors, but even the specific names of their enemies and some of their specific epithets. Even the association Baal's home, Mount Saphon, is identified in Psalm 48 with Mount Zion, which is Jerusalem. So they know that these are old traditions, or at least I think that they know that, because they don't just call it Saphon. They make an identification there, and it's not the only place where that happens. So names, home, enemy names, as well as the general features are suggestive of a kind of cultural, perhaps even intercultural interaction between Baal and Yahweh, in which Yahweh is being attributed these positive features and traditions about Baal. We could say the same thing for other deities, not just the god El, who is kind of the older god of the pantheon, and even his wife Asherah becomes part of the association with Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. There are also some subtle signs of the goddess Anat's sort of constellation of features. She's a warrior goddess. She's sort of the same generation of Baal. El and Asherah are older in the Ugaritic texts, at least for the most part. And then Baal and Anat are the next generation. And there's that next generation, the second tier of deities, are often warriors. So also Astarte and Resheph and a number of other, what I think of as second tier or second level deities. In any case, Yahweh is, yes, I mean, not everything that we know from the other deities, but many things that we know about them are eventually attributed to Yahweh.
So my next question would be then, how is it possible that, since the beginning was very similar, like in the culture of Ugarit and the culture of ancient Israel, there was this polytheistic background, so very similar cultural background and religious background, but one developed, so to speak, towards monotheism and the other one did not. Like you showed a text before, Ugaritic poetry, and I was wondering in my mind, what if some theologians 2000 years later had taken that book and transformed it into some monotheistic, you see what I mean? So
Yeah.
basically the question is, how did we move towards monotheism at that point?
So I think that to answer your question, we have to shift focus from the old traditional religious culture of ancient Israel and its neighbors from the early Iron Age down through, say, the 9th or 8th century. And in the 9th and 8th century, Israel faces another major culture which has major impact on it. And that's the Assyrians and then later the Babylonians. And one of the things that we see in Assyrian and Babylonian texts is developing, say, from the 8th century on, perhaps a little earlier, but from the 8th century on, is what we might call a super god, a god who is recognized as being totally over and even beyond all the other deities. So this is the view of Marduk, not only in the famous creation epic, as it's sometimes called, or the epic of creation. It's not really a creation epic. It's really about Marduk's greatness, the exaltation of Marduk. In Akkadian, it's known, the title is taken from the first two words of the text, Enuma Elish, when on high. And it's really about the exaltation of Marduk. And he's so far above all the other gods that they do not understand him. And this is a kind of a view of Marduk that we get in a series of other Akkadian texts at this time. Marduk is not the only deity who's treated this way. We get some others about the warrior god Ninurta and a number of other deities. But there's a number of texts in Akkadian in this period where all the other gods are viewed as aspects of the god Marduk. And that Marduk is really the reality, the divine reality. And what some scholars argue, and I think with reason, is that the issue of a single God in the universe becomes a more burning, pressing issue in the late monarchy in Israel through the exile and into the Persian period, the post-exilic period. And specifically, they see sort of two processes happening at the same time, which might remind you of what I said a little bit earlier about the Ugaritic text, where you, on the one hand, you're sort of taking what you view as positive and you're pushing away what you think of as negative. What they think of as negative is other gods in Israel. But what they do is they do seem to draw on some of the language and worldview of Mesopotamia in seeing Yahweh as a super warrior god. And this is really because of the problem of empire. Empire creates this question, which was never a question in ancient Israel before the Assyrians. The Assyrians, an empire means power being everywhere in your worldview. I'm not talking literally, but this is the way you think of your empire goes throughout the entire universe. And they translate this idea eventually into their deity, who is their patron god. Where Israel and its neighbors had national gods, and they could recognize the other national gods in their neighborhood before the 7th century. For example, the speech of Jephthah to the Ammonites in chapter 11 of Judges. He says, doesn't Chemosh your God do for you what Yahweh our God does for us? I mean, they kind of have this understanding that that's the way it is with national gods. But with the Assyrians, this all changes. This kind of worldview becomes extremely problematic, and Israel seems to translate what we might call earlier a kind of single-minded devotion to God, you shall not have other gods before me, into a worldview that actually pushes out the reality of those other gods in their literature. And I could give more information about signs that scholars have discerned in the biblical record of direct Assyrian impact on the Hebrew Bible in books such as Deuteronomy, which is one of our most monotheistic books, or in the book of Isaiah, or in, I was going to mention another example, but I'll pause right now on that. Oh, 2nd Isaiah is especially, even more so than 1st Isaiah. 2nd Isaiah is really quite monotheistic, and it's a work that scholars generally date to the period of the exile. So the timing is very good for putting this scenario together. Just have to remember that there's a lot of things we don't know about how all this happened. No one sat down and wrote us a biblical book or something else that says, this is how our religious history happened. Or this is where we only know things from the remains of the day. We infer based on our study of those remains what happened. We're sort of like textual archaeologists who find all this material, and we have to figure out how it all happened.
So basically, the figure of Yahweh came to take shape through convergence of attributes coming from other deities and differentiation from other deities, but also at a certain point when we start moving towards monotheism. And by the way, you also remember in one of your books that monotheism, as well as religion, as well as the Bible itself, these are terms that we use today that didn't exist then. But so at this passage started to happen around the 8th century, 7th century, correct?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly, but perhaps beginning in the 8th century and accelerating through the 7th and 6th centuries.
And I guess it was also, there was the push of the Assyrian Empire, but also internally we can say that there was the work and interpretation, so to speak, of the priesthood, or I don't know who was the editor or the writer of this text, who started to reread, maybe retrospectively, the ancient polytheism in a new light, in a new way.
Well, we see some of that.
So there was some theological or ideological agenda that, so to speak, is this correct?
We can call it ideological because that's what we always think of priests and kings being about, because we think they're about power, but they're trying to just understand and interpret their own past as well. And they're doing just what everybody else is doing at the same time. I'm not opposed to viewing certain aspects of priestly culture as ideological, but I would say what isn't ideological in the Hebrew Bible or any text of the ancient Near East. So I want to be careful about this way in which we sort of focus on priesthood equals ideology and other stuff, maybe not so much so. I don't know that I really believe that, but be that as it may, a wonderful example of priestly reinterpretation of the past is in the book of Exodus. In chapter 6, verses 2-3, when God appears to Moses, this is taken to be a classic priestly passage. It uses a title of the god El, which the priestly writer it's a traditional title that we also know in the older poetry in Genesis 49, but the priestly writer in the Pentateuch seems to really like this title and uses it quite a number of times in the book of Genesis. And he says in chapter 6 of Exodus, verses 2 to 3, paraphrase, is I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name Yahweh, I did not make myself known. So what they're doing is they're taking a kind of religious past, which does reflect something of, the culture that they were trying to understand, but it does seem to reflect a kind of viewpoint about the stages of Israelite religion. Now, and they're going to demarcate that at Moses. Now, I might demarcate that a little bit later in time, like Elijah or somebody else. I don't really like stages because it's too clean for what we know. So I avoid the term like stages. Even development can imply a certain developmental or evolutionary schema of things that I would caution against. I think these things were very complex, that you have different rates of change of different religious worldviews at different places and times. So it's not that it all was a uniform development.
But you mentioned El Shaddai. What is the translation for El Shaddai?
Well, in antiquity, they struggled with the translation. So the Greek makes it God Almighty. But in fact, there's not really much basis in Semitic languages for Shaddai as Almighty. I can tell you my own favorite theory, but you have to remember it's kind of a theory. So we know a number of texts where El is quite prominent. One of them is a text that I've already mentioned today, which is the so-called Balaam inscription from Deir Allah that's paralleled by the Balaam in the book of Numbers in chapters 22 to 24. And in this Balaam inscription, El appears to the prophet at night and gives him a series of prophetic visions. And part of the vision is this god El appearing, but also in the company of a series of gods who are called Shaddaim in the plural. And my suspicion, and here I'm following a number of other scholars, is that this becomes a kind of word for the gods that meet on the mountain. That is because the divine council meets on the mountain, and Shaddai could be the mountain god, whether he is, what that means exactly, we're not 100% sure. For El, it could be because he presides over the divine council. But whatever it is, because we know this word in an old inscription, and we also have signs of it, it's interesting. The places in the Bible where El Shaddai or El at least is prominent, is not only in the priestly writer, but also in the Balaam poems that are in chapters 23 and 24 of the book of Numbers, where you have things like El parallel with Yahweh and so on. So many scholars believe that the Transjordan region, which is where Deir Allah is, which is where Balaam is located in the story in the book of Numbers in chapters 22 to 24. They believe that this is one place where we actually are seeing, both in the Bible and outside of the Bible, a repository of El traditions. And they may include the idea of El plus the Shaddaian, or his own title, El Shaddai.
But don't you think it would have been more correct to, because I checked with my Bible and I see that the translation here that I have in Italian is God Almighty, something like that. But then in the footnote, they say, actually it means El Shaddai, something like God of the mountain. So I think, wouldn't it be more correct to actually put it in the text, God of the mountain, and maybe in the footnote, the other way around, precisely for the reason that we said before, because otherwise we would, superimpose our own interpretation to the what the text actually says.
Just let's be careful though. Even Shaddai, as I'm suggesting, as possibly as mountain, is also an interpretation. It's based on kind of modern scholarly investigation of our sources. It's it's a pretty good interpretation, but it's no less interpretive than what the Septuagint had, Almighty, and what your translation has. So we have to remember some things. We have to be sensitive to the degrees of knowledge that we have about these things before we jump into putting these things in translations. Once you put something into a translation, then readers who don't have access to the kind of information that you and I have been talking about, they think that's the Bible's God-given truth. And in this case, maybe it is and maybe it isn't. I actually don't mind what your Bible has. I think the fact that they've got it in a note for people to know is good enough for me. And I don't mind, yes, of course, the translation of the Septuagint. Well, I mean, but that doesn't bother me. That is a certain amount, especially in cases where we really don't know for sure. I'm not as prepared to substitute sort of my modern scholarly supposition for the ancient translators' own suppositions about these things so quickly. And a compromise solution, such as what your Bible has, with Almighty up in your translation, but Mountain in your footnote, that sits pretty well with me.
Yes, actually, I was wondering though, for example, we translate in the Bibles that we have today, in Italian is Dio, in English is God. The term Elohim is translated with God, for example. But I have a problem with that. That doesn't come from, I know there is a debate, because Elohim is plural, but, it has a singular meaning and so on. But what I think is the idea that we have of God is a Greek Hellenistic idea of God that is transcendental, omnipotent, omniscient, and I think we might maybe read the Bible with this idea, with the filters through the glasses of this, monotheistic idea of Neoplatonic God and so on, and attribute some of our values to that. Don't you see like a danger here that we put in the Bible a concept that is much later, or in any case, it's a concept that it was not original in the Bible, or maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. What do you think about this?
Well, first of all, you've actually mentioned two issues that are not necessarily inherently connected. One is the translation of Elohim as God, and the other are the characteristics surrounding that deity. Again, I don't mind the translation God. I mean, we have to start where we are. When we translate, we're not just translating to try to get an autograph of the past. We have to make sense in the present. And God is, just like religion is. We're going to stop talking about religion just because it's not a word in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. I don't think so. It is our entryway into these topics as moderns, and we simply need to be cognizant that those labels may not be sufficient. And so we need to talk about them rather than just getting rid of them, at least in my opinion. Now, let me say something. I mean, I could say more about the etymology of Elohim, but again, you're getting
interesting, yes.
Yeah, I mean, you're getting into interpretive territory once again. Many people would say, well, we don't really know the etymology properly. The best etymology might be from a middle weak root, that is Aleph, Yod, or Vav, in the middle plus L, Lamed, as a root that means to be strong. So it's a pretty good etymology. I rather like it, but it's not clear that the ancient writers of the Bible actually knew that etymology. So we have to be careful that when we etymologize, we're not assuming that they know the etymologies. They don't run around with dictionaries in the ancient Near East unless they're scholars in Mesopotamia or elsewhere. They had word lists where they do this kind of thing. But most people who are using the word Elohim weren't thinking, oh, I think the etymology of this is. Because we don't have that many uses of that root in Hebrew. I mean, outside of the word Elohim and the short form El, we don't actually have a lot of the usage. We have some, but not a lot. So we have to be careful not to commit what is sometimes called the etymological fallacy, that we assume that ancients know the etymologies of all of the words that they use. This is true for us in modern cultures. Most people don't know the etymologies of the words that they're talking about. Who knows that panther in English, Panthera, it means all beast? Nobody knows that as far as I know, but that's what it is. So we have to be careful about not imputing meanings to words based simply on etymologies in terms of how people knew what they were saying. Now let's go back to your other question, which has to do with whether we're superimposing our later Greco-Roman Platonic kind of notions of deity onto the God of the Old Testament. Now, certainly we're going to see a certain amount of language and worldview from later periods accruing to the interpretation of the biblical God in their period. The question for me is that just de novo? Is that just something that's made up in the Greco-Roman period? In other words, it may be Platonic ideals, and the whole Platonic structure of thinking is very much, of course, not indigenous to ancient Israel. However, they had their own ways. I think of them as mostly narrativized ways of expressing omniscience on the part of the deity, or of being everywhere. And they don't do it in the way that we're used to, because we've gotten used to Greco-Roman formulations. You know, we use propositional language. Ancient Israel doesn't use propositional language as much. It uses depiction. And the worldview is embedded in the depiction. I'll give you one example. You look at the vision of Ezekiel in chapter 1, the so-called chariot throne vision. Now, it's got the details of that vision are expressing, it's got wheels that go in all four directions, can go in all four directions, and they've got eyeballs. And that's Ezekiel's way of saying God sees in all four directions. And this isn't we have similar Mesopotamian depictions of Marduk, not the chariot vision with the eyeballs, but other ways of expressing this kind of knowledge of God, or God, of deity, and also of that sort of combines omniscience and presence everywhere potentially. You know, when it says in the Psalms and in First Kings that the heavens cannot contain him, they're talking about a vision of God that is in effect everywhere. It's so great. You can, I mean, the universe is the heavens are just like a drop in the bucket for a deity like that. Now, when are those texts produced? Of course, they're being produced in this later period. These are not the kind of things you find in the so-called older poetry of biblical Israel, but you do find it in things like Ezekiel and Second Isaiah and the Deuteronomistic material in First Kings, and all of that 7th, 6th century or so. So to my mind, you're already, I would have said that these kinds of characteristics of God that we think of as you know, maybe more systematically expressed in the Greco-Roman context and even later among the so-called early church writers and creeds and so on, all these kinds of things. Well, they have real roots in the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. They're not just something that they made up secondarily and entirely superimposed, in my opinion. I think the question is, do we think of a kind of process of superimposition on the part of, say, 8th, 7th, 6th century writers on the traditions that they've received? Well, they're interpreting them, is the way I would view this, in light of their own circumstances. That in the wake of the Assyrian and Babylonian and later Persian empires, we're seeing a shift in thinking, which includes not only, you know, a kind of worldview of one God that views all the other gods as impotent, but also that these characteristics of God that we think of so common in our later literature are already starting to emerge. Omniscience, being everywhere, are starting to emerge in the, say, 7th, 6th century context, 5th century. Anyway.
But if I can reply to you, actually, this is all very interesting. I was thinking, though, still Elohim, because if I read the Bible in translation, because I don't know ancient Hebrew, but if I read it and I see that Elohim is translated in many different ways. So sometimes it's translated like God, sometimes it's gods, plural, sometimes it is angels, sometimes it is like in Psalm 82, I found some
It's not
translation.
angels. It's not angels. The word for angels is malachim. If translations render it, what they're doing is they're uncomfortable with seeing Elohim sometimes designating, or B'nai Elohim designating, what we'd call sort of divinities or deities with a small d. And
Okay.
I think that, and so for example, in the book of Job, in chapter 1, verse 6, and chapter 2, verse 1, the sons of God come before God up in heaven, and they're going to give their report about what they've seen on earth. And the Satan, it's a title, is among them. He's probably one of these B'nai Elohim. So in their case, I would have translated something like divinities with a small d or something like that, but they're not. The word angels is a distinctively different word in biblical Hebrew. And if a translation is rendering Elohim as angels, they're making an extremely strong interpretive move. I understand where it comes from, but it's just to say, look, every word in Hebrew has potentially different meanings. So I'm reacting to the beginning of your question, which is, there's no surprise that Elohim is rendered differently, because it means different things in different contexts. And sometimes it refers to this one God, and sometimes it refers to plural gods or divinities with a small d. So it doesn't bother me in the least that we've got different translations, as long as there is a real correspondence semantically between the translation and the word in Hebrew. And I think that using God with a capital G for Elohim, when it clearly refers to the singular, the God of Israel, I don't have a problem with that as a translation. And all translations run the risk of later associations that people have with those words. So you're not going to get, there's no pristine way to get around that as a translator, in my opinion. And that's why people need to go to university and colleges and seminaries in order to learn all this stuff, or to just read books on their own. I mean, people can pick up books and they can
read, of course.
They can read. And of course, that's the great thing about modernity. It wasn't true necessarily in the Middle Ages.
I was thinking something specific, actually, because I had in mind the Psalm 82, where sometimes that I know that you spoke about it in your book. So and in some translations that I found, Elohim is translated with judges here. And another example was like in Genesis 6, I think, if I remember correctly, when they say that the sons of the Elohim found that the women, the daughters of the men, were attractive, and so they took them as wives, and so on. And that is Elohim. And in my Bible, at least, which is the official Bible of the Italian bishops, in the footnote, they say, well, we think here Elohim means angels. This is why I said angels before. But of course, it could be some error there. But in any case, what I wanted to ask, I was puzzled by all these different meanings with Elohim, and you answered it. I was wondering maybe if Elohim could be a relic of some polytheistic past, also given the fact that it's plural, although it has a singular meaning, but it could be something that comes from the past that is not being corrected, or it is being corrected in the theological work towards monotheism.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put too much weight on the grammatical question as such. We have the phrase Binu Elima, which could be sons, the divine sons. It could also be the sons of El. who would, of course, by virtue of being the sons of El, would also be understood as divine. So it's a little ambiguous, but it's already ambiguous a little bit in the Ugaritic text.
Okay.
I do think it is part of a polytheistic past. And I do think that ancient translations that take them as angels are sort of, they are reflecting what I think is already going on in the late biblical period. In the late biblical period, I think they actually are taking signs of angels and other figures as not gods. That is, we often forget that angels in the older culture were actually the lowest level or tier of divinity in both Ugaritic and in the Bible. And what happens in the late biblical period is that angels are I think reinterpreted as being part of the created order. So in late Psalms, it says that God created angels, but no one would have said that for Canaanite angels, malachim, or for early biblical angels. We don't have that kind of language of creation for them. So they're reinterpreting them in light of their own later Greco-Roman period. Well, Greco-Roman could also be Persian, not clear. But anyway, post-exilic experience. In Psalm 82, verse 6, God thought you were God. I thought you were gods, according to verse 6. You know, literally I said, but used in this analogical sense. And that all of you are sons of Elyon, who's kind of a high God. But the whole point of the psalm, it's really interesting to me, is because at the end it says, but no, you're going to die like any human, and like princes, you will fall. So this is a psalm that on the one hand shows this older background of a kind of, I sort of view it as a kind of mild polytheism compared to Ugarit, but let's not worry about that descriptor. But they're also saying, but it's not really true. That mild polytheism isn't really true. And they sort of dramatize, they give a kind of polytheistic to monotheistic drama in this psalm, which people have just found incredibly difficult because they say, how could they acknowledge that it really was once polytheistic? But I think that's our problem and not theirs, as I see it.
Who is Elyon?
So that's a great question. So literally it means most high. It's from Ayin Lamed Yod, to be high, to go up. And the N on the end is a kind of nominal suffix or sufformative, which is very common in biblical Hebrew. It would refer to whoever you think is the highest God in your context. So the word is used for El in Genesis 14, El Elyon, which seems, and that makes a certain amount of sense because El is a high God we know from elsewhere. But in Ugaritic, the short form of Elyon, Ali, is actually used for the god Baal. So it's a sort of title that can be used for different gods, whoever is the high god in your context that you are referring to. In our context, some people want to say, oh, this is an old reflex of the god El. And that's quite possible because the opening of the psalm in Psalm 82 is that it starts off by saying Elohim Nitzav Adat El. It sort of plays on our word El and Elohim. Literally, Elohim, singular, stands up in the council or assembly. This is the divine council in heaven. It's like a last judgment scene. Think of Michelangelo and, you know, this is in the Sistine Chapel. Anyway, you know, you got the last judgment scene up there in the council of El. Now, El at the end there, some people want to just take it as an adjective meaning a divine, but it could be a kind of a word play on the god El. So it could be Elohim, maybe referring to Yahweh standing up in the council of El, because the God who stands up is the one who classically delivers the indictment, and the assembly is run by a high God like El, who's going to give the judgment at the end. That's sort of the background to this imagery in Psalm 82.
Now, who are the participants of this council?
Well, presumably it's the gods who are being addressed later on. I had taken all of you for being Elohim. So what we seem to have is a kind of almost courtroom type drama. I'm going to use the word courtroom. It's an assembly or a council of gods sitting around. It has an executive who is the Elyon figure, whoever it is. We've got Elohim standing up. That's the one who's giving the accusation, as opposed to the one who is ruling over the thing, who's presumably seated. That's the typical situation for the one who's running it. The one who stands up gives the accusation, and the accusation is made against all of you. And all of you are the Elohim that are going to be condemned. So those seem to be the participants in this almost courtroom-like proceedings in Psalm 82.
It's very interesting to me that there is this council of gods, especially with connection to the other passage that you read before, that you mentioned before, Deuteronomy 32, I think, where Elyon, if I understand, distributes the lands,
Right.
so to speak, to. And these passages are very impressive because they seem to contradict a whole, monotheistic structure. So they're very powerful in my opinion, and they make me wonder. I say it honestly. I was born and raised Catholic.
Me too.
And I have to tell you that I started losing my faith when I started reading the Bible.
Not me. I get a lot of questions, all these kinds of questions. Doesn't this bother your faith? And I say, nope, doesn't bother my faith at all, because people realize things over time. It isn't as if just because we're discovering that these things are sort of problematic, they're problematic for what we're making assumptions about what the Bible is doing. But we also know that over time, people come to further realization about the nature of divine reality. It doesn't all pop out from the beginning. And if it did, we wouldn't have a New Testament, would we? But we accept as Christians that the New Testament has what we think are substantially important, perhaps somewhat new revelation for us as Christians. But so I'm not really so sure that we should let it bother us too much, that we see some developments also shifting perceptions of worldview embedded within the Hebrew Bible. Now, we do that for some reason, namely that the larger trend of the Hebrew Bible is to obscure some of these developments, and I accept that. But that still doesn't bother me very much about faith. Thomas Aquinas had a great line, which I think I always get a little bit wrong, where he says something like, the order of reality is not the order of discovery. That is, the order in which humans come to understand reality is not the same as the order itself. And I think that a certain view of progressive revelation is something that's not just something we see between the two testaments, the Old and New Testament, but I think it's something we also see within the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament itself. It doesn't bother me.
No, of course. I think the faith in God is something that goes beyond the interpretation that we can, give to the scriptures. Although, of course, many people believe these are sacred scripture. To me,
Sure.
these are very, very interesting pieces of ancient literature that should be read very carefully because they contain a lot of beautiful information about what we are, where we come from, and so on. But it's important to talk about these things precisely because so many people believe that these books are sacred and they follow them sometimes to the letter. So it's always very difficult to. But I was wondering actually, Professor.
Well, let me just interject that I believe both. I believe what you think about the Bible, and I believe what religious people believe about the Bible. And I do not see those as, I'm Catholic in my perspective, and Catholic, in the sense of universal, intellectually encompasses things that may not always sit easily together, because we know these things are complicated and are complex. And I think, yes, of course, you can get into the question of how literal, one follows such things. But remember, even the Catholic Church says from the Vatican II Council that what the scriptures contain, they don't say it has every historical truth in it or that everything that in it is historically true, et cetera, et cetera. What it says is is that it contains everything necessary for salvation. And so we got to be very careful about how we sort of respond to how what we think the church teaches, because we might have an idea that the Bible should be A, B, and C for the church. But even the church, I think the Catholic Church has really quite a very sophisticated sense of what Scripture is. And I would recommend a book in this vein, for especially for those of you comfortable in English,
Yes.
a book called The Bible and the Believer, which is a book by 3 excellent biblical scholars, one Jewish, one Protestant, and one Catholic. And they all have responses to one another at the end of each of their essays, in which they discuss exactly what you and I have been talking about. And they're very thoughtful essays. And I think that there's a lot of news for a lot of Catholics about how sophisticated the church has been in the last, I would have said since the Second World War. I mean, it's sort of zigzagged a little bit, but ever since Divino Afflante Spiritu, I think it's 1942 or 1943, the treatment of the Bible has become more and more sophisticated in the Catholic Church on the part of both scholars who work with hierarchy, who work in the church, who work in Catholic schools, and Catholic scholars who don't work in those settings. For example, my own situation right now, I teach at a Protestant seminary, and I'm not the only one. So it's just to say that you know, if all Catholics knew church teaching about the Bible, I think they'd have less problems about the Bible.
So do you think that people should read the Bible by themselves, or they should actually go through? Because I remember that I think, I don't know until what point in history it was forbidden to read the Bible by oneself. It was always necessary to read through the interpretation of priests or theologians or whatever.
Well, I think the Catholic Church certainly recognized that having some guidance would be helpful to people, and I think that that's true. I'm of course a fan of people reading the Bible, but I am also a fan of people getting good guidance about reading the Bible, especially when they're staking their lives on it. They ought to understand it better if it's that important to them. And I do think that, you know, reading or taking courses, etc., is an extremely helpful practice next to their own practices of reading the Bible for their own spiritual edification. I have a lot of trouble with some traditional practices where people just open up the Bible, put their finger down and says, that's where God's speaking to me today. People have to remember that God did not speak to us first. God spoke to ancient Israel first. And we have to understand how God spoke to them in the Bible if we want better to understand how God is speaking to people today through the Bible.
Professor, can we say that if for a believer, it would be good to both listen to the teaching of the church and read the Bible? Because I have the impression when I used to go to church that 90% of the people there have never opened the Bible in their lives, and they were just listening from the pulpit what they would say.
No, I think that it's true that we haven't developed sufficient mechanisms for bridging the gap between you know, Catholic biblical scholarship and other biblical scholarship as known and reflected in many of our good church documents on the Bible and the wider Catholic public. And I totally get that. I mean, that is a long-standing challenge for the church. And I don't see it being overcome anytime soon. And I think one of the problems is, on the one hand, we're seeing more Catholics read the Bible, which I think is tremendous, but because we're also not perhaps doing enough educationally, reading the Bible on your own can, especially in a cultural context like the United States, where we have a tradition outside the Catholic Church of people reading the Bible on their own and just interpreting it as they see it, that is a danger also for Catholic readers, as it is for anyone who just opens up the Bible and reads for themselves. And never really broaches the question of, well, what might this have meant to ancient Israelites or to the early church in its own time, speaking of the New Testament. So that I applaud that more Catholics are reading the Bible. I think that's great. But I also think that there's a big educational challenge there.
How can I ask, how was the reception of your work about the ancient Israel polytheism in the scientific community as well as outside? Because I have the impression that maybe there was some sharing of your views within the academia. Maybe outside is not very common to know the background, the polytheistic background.
Yeah, so I would say that the shift in perspective that's reflected in my books, which is building on the work of lots of other people, I have to be very clear about that, has, I think, become sort of the paradigm that most people think about when it comes to the history of Israelite religion. I mean, they may not like it very much because of their own religious perspectives, but I think that it's certainly taken a strong hold in the academic community. There is a kind of backlash to it, which is not surprising given the religious views that people have. But I don't think that backlash is very substantial. It's okay. I mean, scholars have lots of different opinions, and that's the way it's going to be. It doesn't bother me. Outside of the academic world, it's interesting. I think what you're saying generally is true. Generally, this is not known in the wider circles in churches and synagogues and so on, except among lay readers, people who pick up books and start looking at this question, which of course is not, percentage-wise a lot of people, but I get a lot of emails from people asking me about this, and I do get my share of emails and questions from students about how does this affect my faith or not, and I really respect. I really respect that challenge for people. I think it's harder for people who came from strong Bible backgrounds, especially Protestants, evangelicals, for whom the worldview stands or falls on whether, the Bible really is true in a way that's much broader and extensive than, say, the classic Catholic view. But I respect them. I respect their desire to know God better and to be faithful people. At the same time, I can see how these kinds of questions, especially about the kinds of stuff we're talking about, is going to be very challenging for some of them.
Thank you very much. For all those that are not in the academia, I feel to recommend this book, The Memoirs of God, because it summarizes very beautifully what we have said tonight, and I put the description, the link in the description actually under the video. But to finish, Professor, if you have 5 minutes, I wanted to ask you 2 questions that are not related to our conversation tonight.
Okay.
More curiosities that I have. As a man of faith and a scholar, the first question is, we live in very interesting times, as Slavoj Žižek would say. We have 2 popes. How do you see that? Do you see like it's dangerous to the life of the church? Like, do you feel more attracted towards one or the other? Because for example, I know that in Italy there's a really big debate and fight between the 2 factions almost, and sometimes they talk about schism.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that about Italy. I probably at this distance don't feel it as strongly. I feel that Catholics should be attentive to their current Pope, not the one who's no longer Pope. I mean, he's Pope Emeritus or whatever his title is, and that's fine. And we can respect many of the good things that he did. He wrote very good things about the Bible. He wrote about 2 creation stories. Ratzinger, Benedict, wrote about 2 creation stories in Genesis. So he is a learned guy. A former professor at Tübingen, one of the greatest universities in the world. I respect I respect our past Pope, but I'm a Catholic today. I'm not a Catholic back in the time of Benedict now, and I am very much in tune with where our present Pope seems to be. And I think it's incumbent upon Catholics. I sometimes hear, this political thing. I think that if you don't like a certain Pope, you have to endure it faithfully. And this notion of schism and factions and so on, I think for a Catholic is idolatrous. And I think that Catholics who engage in that sort of political endeavor are not exercising proper faith. And, it's going to go back. Benedict was succeeded by Francis. We'll have another Pope after Francis. And knowing the way things go, we could be back to someone like Benedict or John Paul II, because the popes differ. And this is the way it's going to be. So I talk of factions and schisms, I find deeply troubling from a spiritual point of view. And I really think that people who engage in that or think in those terms should examine their own consciences about it.
One of the latest interviews that I have done here on this channel was with Professor Avi Loeb from the astronomy department at Harvard, and he thought that this celestial body called Oumuamua was actually artificial in origin and not natural. So we spoke about extraterrestrial life and so on. I live nearby Campo de Fiori in Rome, where Giordano Bruno was burned because of, you've been to Rome.
I've seen the statue, I know.
So he was burned there because he was, believed in the plurality of the word exoplanets, we would call them today, and extraterrestrial life, basically. So in the light of this, the report from the Pentagon on UAP that just came out, unidentified aerial phenomena. As a man of faith, as a scholar, how do you see that? Is that troubling from a spiritual point of view, like the idea of extraterrestrial life? How do you see that?
Well, I would say that it doesn't bother me very much. Where science goes, faith has to go. I mean, look at it. One of the interesting things, I have a friend named Edward Wright, who wrote a book called The Early History of Heaven. It's a very fun book in which he shows how worldview about God and the world, etc., changed in the Greco-Roman period with astronomical knowledge. And, we went from heaven, earth, underworld to a worldview that had to do with multiple levels of heavens. And this was sort of a Greco-Roman change. And we see this in Second Temple literature, some of these changes. Paul talks about going up to whatever it is, the third heaven. So we have changes in worldview based on our knowledge of science. And I think our faith has to embrace what our science properly gives us. And, if they prove that there are extraterrestrials out there or that they're already here living among us, etc., great.
Do you have an opinion about that?
No, I don't have a strong opinion. I think it's entirely plausible, but I'm also a person of data. I want people to really provide me with data. I think this thing that flew by our solar system was extremely interesting. It's one of the more provocative and plausible sounding things. But I often get this kind of question about extraterrestrials in lectures and so on. And I said, I'm not opposed to it. I just want data. And I need data. I mean, if I'm gonna be a proper investigator, I have to work with data and not just supposition. So, until I have something that feels, if we were somehow able to acquire on Earth a form of metal that our scientists all agreed was not earthly and was not natural, that might be some pretty provocative evidence that we in fact have something that's extraterrestrial. that is something that shows that it was worked, not just that it comes from off the planet. I'd be open to that. Why not?
Professor Smith, thank you very much for your time tonight. It was a very pleasurable talk with you. And I invite everyone to read your books that I put in the description of the video, and to share and like and subscribe if they want. And thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to me. And I enjoyed all of your questions, and the best with everything. Thank you.